was this beast organized? Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you, and thank you for the invitation. Is this not on?
Yes.
Is it on? You can hear me? Okay. Thank you very much again. A privilege to be with you, and to speak to you for shortly, for a short while. Professors tend to answer questions that nobody else is asking. So I shall be brief and rather invite your intervention by way of questions, which I shall endeavor to respond to. I'm going to speak to you about a period of my life which will undoubtedly be the most significant of my life, even if I live for a long, long time to come. And that was to share in an active way in the political transition in South Africa from a highly conflictual apartheid situation through to the beginning of democracy, and to serve at the pleasure of President Mandela on the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was one of the more significant institutes and organizations of transition in the process of trying to manage that process of moving from the past into the future. Always a difficult thing. That Truth Commission, you will understand, was located in the interregnum, as they say, between a past that was not yet born, not yet dead, and a future that was not yet born. An uncomfortable place to be. I'm going to talk to you about that. I know that Professor Ranch has spoken with you about the South African history, told you about that. I'm not going to repeat that. It was a long and a treacherous history. Colonialism, going back to 1652, statutory apartheid, reaching back to 1948, people torn apart because of difference in skin color, culture, understanding of life. I'm going to leave that as having been dealt with, and I'm going to jump into that ever-moving stream. In 1990, on the 11th of February 1990, 11th of February 1990, a date ingrained in my mind and in my soul, because that was the day that President de Klerk, President of South Africa at the time, stood up in Parliament and said that all the political organizations, the African National Congress, Pan-Africanist Congress, South Africanist Communist Party, all banned political organizations are unbanned as of now. He left many of us speechless. And further, he said that all political prisoners will be released, and that Mr. Mandela, who'd been in jail for 27 years, would be released within days, as soon as the necessary arrangements, the logistics could be taken care of. And he was released. You will understand the magnitude of that moment. Of course, there had been talks, there had been negotiations between largely the African National Congress that had been in exile and the South African regime. Eventually, those talks were taking place with Mr. Mandela in prison. He was eventually given a telephone in prison to communicate with his colleagues and comrades who were in exile. A remarkable story. And I'm not going to go into that story right now. And so obviously, Mr. Mandela, obviously de Klerk, Obviously, the inner circle of both of these people knew this moment was coming. But us plebs, even those of us who were a little politically involved, were taken quite and totally by surprise. I have since asked Mr. de Klerk whether his cabinet knew. He said he informed them an hour or two before he delivered his address in Parliament that this was going to happen. Quite a remarkable story. Mr. Mandela, of course, had to take his colleagues with him, those in exile and those young Turks at home who were saying the old man has gone a little senile. He's beginning to sell out. And he got them together. And I remember so clearly shortly after he came out of prison, he was speaking with a group, probably to have filled this auditorium in Cape Town, and many of them were highly critical and said, we have fought all these years. How can we now sit down and compromise and settle? And Mr. Mandela said, I've been in prison for 27 years. I know what we've been through. We are going to settle. We are going to negotiate. And I want to promise you, if we don't get a reasonable settlement, I am ready to go back to prison. The audience exploded in appreciation, in applause. Mr. Mandela, coming out of prison after 27 years as a man of peace, a man extending his hand to his enemies, to those people who put him in jail, to those people who effectively broke up his family and his family life. And he said, we are ready to reconcile. This was initiated, as I've said, on the 11th of February, 1990. Within just over a week, Mr. Mandela walked out of Verster prison in Pretoria, in Cape Town. That began a negotiation period, a long and difficult negotiation period, which lasted between 3 and 4 years, depending on when you start counting. And ultimately, there was an agreement between the old regime and the exile movement. The newspapers like to say between white Afrikaners and black Africans. You know, that's the sort of hype about it all. The beginning of 1996, middle of 1996, South Africans who negotiated, and it was an all-in negotiation. I said so yesterday. Anybody who was prepared to come and sit down, lay down their arms and look for peace could come. And that mixed group of people agreed to an interim constitution. The 1996 interim constitution. And right at the end of those negotiations, the question emerged, which had always been in the background, but it emerged yet again, and people were saying, what are we going to do with those people who committed gross violations of human rights during this period? What are we going to do with those people who assassinated people, who killed people, who raped people, who committed the most horrendous deeds? And you saw a little bit about that, I believe, in the film last night. And so our negotiators came up with what they called a postscript to the interim constitution. Have you heard of a postscript? I'd never heard of one. I've heard of a prescript, all sorts of things, a postscript, sort of thing added on the end. So we've contributed to the English language as well. And that postscript effectively said, there shall be some form of amnesty for perpetrators of gross human rights And the terms of that amnesty will be decided by the first democratically elected parliament. It was, again, a very, very tense moment. Well, Parliament sat, a new Parliament, predominantly ANC members, overwhelmingly black, and they negotiated, which would ultimately lead to the final Constitution of 1998. But in the process, they had an obligation to decide on this thing called amnesty in one form or another. And in that heated debate, there were really two arguments being made. Many of those who have now returned from exile, some of the very, very angry people who were back home, said, we've got to have Nuremberg trials. That's what you do. That's what the international community is doing. And in fact, the international community were busy discussing, but had not yet ratified the Rome Statute that gave rise to the International Criminal Court. Everything was saying there ought to be trials. Above all, for those who took greatest responsibility for the violation of the rights of others. And so the call for Nuremberg-type trials was upheld. I was teaching a seminar at Georgetown only on Wednesday concerning the Nuremberg trials. And when people think about dealing with something in the wake of major atrocities, the first thought that comes to mind is the Nuremberg trials or the Tokyo trials. That, in a sense, is the high watermark of international justice. And there were many saying, that's what we're required to do. It's the civilized thing, it's the decent thing, and that's what needs to be done, Nuremberg trials. The problem was that if you have a negotiated settlement, and people on one side or the other know that within 6 months, maybe 6 years, they will be on trial for their life, they're not going to settle. They're not going to settle. The apartheid generals, the leaders of the apartheid regime, would not have laid down their arms had they known that there would be some form of Nuremberg trials. And so many of those people said, for heaven's sake, the past is past. Don't look back, look forward. Move on. Apartheid's over. The problem is, as someone once said, that those who have suffered least have a capacity to forget. Those who have suffered most are cursed with a good memory. Cursed with a good memory. And so the vast majority of people in South Africa who were victims of apartheid said, we're not looking to prosecute anybody, but we can't adopt a position of amnesia. Try as we may, the past keeps coming back. And it was within that context, neither Nuremberg trials nor amnesia, that the South Africans decided to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We said effectively to ourselves, we're going to take the next 2 years to have a national conversation. And everybody can talk. And we're going to do this through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We set up three committees within that Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The one was the Human Rights Violations Committee, where we invited people whose basic human rights had been taken away from them. People who had been violated, people who had lost spouses, lost children, lost parents, people who had lost their human dignity in many ways. We invited them to come forward and tell us their story. And over 22,000 people asked to tell their story. We had a dilemma. How do you allow 22,000 people to tell their story? And so we did that thing which most, academics like you and myself do. We said, you've got to take a sample. Hopefully it's representative. Well, we said we can't even make it representative, but we're going to take a sample. And so we invited approximately 10% of those 22,000 people to come and to tell their story. And it was not altogether representative, because we were also working for reconciliation, don't forget. So we made a concerted effort to ensure that among those who came to tell their story, there were some white people whose rights, human rights, were also violated. We made sure that there were some people whose families or who were themselves involved in the South African military or the police, we wanted them also to come and tell their story. So we had roughly 2,200 people telling their story. How did they tell their story? We held hearings throughout the country, from small little hamlets, little towns, what we in South Africa call dorps, and townships and squatter camps. We met in churches and we met in mosques, and we met in schoolrooms and we met under tents. But we traveled around the country listening to these people's stories. At the same time, know this, that those stories were carried live on radio and on television. All the major newspapers in the country had dedicated reporters whose task it was to tell that story. And I remember so well the day that we handed our 5-volume report, a massive beast, to Mr. Mandela in Pretoria. And I remember standing outside the hall where this event was going to happen, getting some fresh air, and a young journalist came up to me and stuck a microphone under my nose and said, "Well, Professor, you do know that this country now has TRC fatigue. We're sick and tired of it." He said, "I can't turn on the radio without hearing some horrendous story. I can't even watch television when I get home in the evenings because there's a repeat of the day's hearings. I can't even open the newspaper and read it without reading some terrible story of somebody who'd been violated in some fundamental and basic way. I've had enough." Well, I got to know this little reporter quite well over the years. I said, "My friend, that's the good news. That's the good news. That nobody in this country can ever again either say they didn't know or it didn't really happen. The denialism was out." That was the purpose of the Human Rights Violations Committee, where people came into an audience, before an audience, with the Archbishop in the chair, and they told their stories. People often said to me, "How did you cope? How did I cope?" Well, one becomes a little bit immune to most things. You learn to live with stories when you've heard enough of them. But every now and again, I want to tell you, there was a story that hit me right between the eyes. And I said, "My God, how can human beings do this to one another?" So we put the lights on. We asked everybody to come inside, to sit down at the table, and to tell their stories. There was no cross-examination. We just said, "Tell us what happened to you." And when we try to make sense of that, we said, there was subjective truth, there was objective truth, there was forensic truth, and there was social truth. But the country was speaking. And there was nobody in South Africa who did not have that word reconciliation on their lips. And some had it on their lips because they said it's a lot of damn nonsense, we can't reconcile. And others had it on their lips because they said, "My goodness, if we don't reconcile, what's the alternative? Are we going to kill ourselves and our kids and our grandkids? When is it going to end?" So that Human Rights Violations Committee left an indelible mark on South Africa. We also had a reparations committee whose task it was to work out what reparations ought to be paid to those people who were violated in the past. The language that the legislation said, how are we going to pay reparations to victims? And you know, there were some young people that stood up and said, hey buddy, I'm not a victim. I was a soldier. I went out there, and therefore I won't take your miserable reparations. It was a difficult time. There were other people who would stand up and say, I lost my sight, I lost my limbs, I lost my children. I don't know where my husband is. My child has disappeared. I need something. It was a difficult decision. And we ultimately, in the commission, rightly or wrongly, and I wasn't very satisfied with it myself, decided there would be an individual payment to every person who was found by the commission to be a victim, an individual payment of 30,000 rands. Well, the rand-dollar exchange rate was twice as strong as it is now, but it was a paltry sum, 30,000 rands for the next 6 years. And making it very, very clear that this is a symbolic recognition of the suffering. I wondered about that, and many of us argued that there ought to be more emphasis on communal reparations, building schools, hospitals, feeding the poor, those sorts of things. But the agreement was we need some sort of symbolic recognition. Now, the sad story is, and I'll come back to this if you're interested in it all, it took the government, the ANC government, the democratically elected government, over 5 years to begin to pay that money out. And when they did, they said, we're not giving 30,000 rands per person for the next 6 years. We're giving a one-off payment of 30,000 rands. Take your money and get out or don't. Very sad story. But we can come back to that one. The third one, and the most contentious dimension of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was amnesty. Big time perpetrators. Not somebody who was guilty of some little indiscretion along the line. People who were serial killers. People who blew people up in public places. People who sent parcel bombs to people. Big time perpetrators. How can you give them amnesty, it was said. We said there's got to be a way of drawing those people back into the new society. And we said there will be conditional amnesty. And here's the crunch. That if a person wants amnesty, that person has got to apply in person for amnesty. And that person has got to appear in a public hearing under the authority of 3 high court judges. And they've got to ask for forgiveness. They'll be given a lawyer, but they've got to be asked for recognition of their application for amnesty. They had to acknowledge what they did. They had to answer questions under cross-examination. They had to respond to the questions that victims of their brutality had asked. And if in the mind of the judges, the Supreme Court, High Court judges, if in the mind of those High Court judges these people had been honest, they were given amnesty. There are approximately 5,500 applications for amnesty. In the end, the Commission only gave 1,200 and something amnesties. The rest were denied. And the Truth and Reconciliation Act, as it went through Parliament, said there shall be conditional amnesty if a person applies for amnesty and convinces the judges that he or she, and they were always a he, had done something. Those people will be given amnesty. But if a person either did not apply for amnesty or refused amnesty, they were subject to prosecution. Now let me tell you another little secret. When the commission closed, we gave a list of approximately 300 names to the Justice Department and said these people have not applied for amnesty or they were denied amnesty and we believe they ought to be investigated. The vast, 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 vast majority of them have never been investigated. One of those strange things. I want to come back to this at the end. So we had a Human Rights Committee, we had a Reparations Committee, we had, controversially, an Amnesty Committee. That amnesty one was the one that hit the headlines. There were human rights organizations around the world that threw their hands in the air in absolute horror. And I remember so clearly Amnesty International saying, "How dare you do it?" And Mr. Mandela stood up in Parliament and said, "I understand that there are some people who are unhappy with our decision to give perpetrators, to give amnesty to perpetrators. We understand their views, but we're giving those people amnesty if they fulfill the conditions, because we are seeking to move on and to build a new country." And that's what happened. Okay? The International Criminal Court was established, was ratified and established in 2002. I've often asked the question, what would have happened in South Africa had that International Criminal Court already been established? Now, America's never signed the Rome Statute, which I think they should. But South Africa signed it. Countries around the world have signed it. My point is simply this, and again I come back to that point. If those people who regarded themselves and who we regarded as major perpetrators, if they knew that they were going to be in jail in 6 months' time, they would not have laid down their arms. So would we have had the settlement that we did have in South Africa if those people were not given some form of amnesty? Let me say just a couple more words about the Commission. Our task was to tell the story of South Africa from 1960, which was the beginning of the armed struggle by rebels, by revolutionary, by liberation movements, 1960, Sharpeville, of those of you who know that history, from then through until 1994 when Mr. Mandela becomes president. We was tasked with giving as complete a picture as possible of what happened in that period of time. And that was largely what I tried to do in the Commission. As the Director of Research and with my colleagues, we tried to do that. We were also asked, and it was largely assumed that it could be done through reparations. Listen to these words, they're haunting words. Comes out of the TRC Act, to restore the human dignity of victims. Now, I love asking my seminar group to tell me how you restore the human dignity of a victim. Not easily. I often used to use a poem that was called Unchopping a Tree. How do you unchop a tree? How do you put the limbs back together? How do you put the leaves on the tree? How do you put the little bugs and the bees and what have you that are flying through the leaves? How do you put it all together? How do you unchop a tree? Restore the human dignity of people. Well, our decision was that the most you can do is to create a society radically different from the past. To create a society within which people will not live in fear of the policeman's knock at the door at 2 o'clock in the morning. To build a society within which our kids will have a decent school, a roof over their heads, clean water. That's the restoration of human dignity. It's a communal thing rather than an individual thing. Well, let me try and draw this together. When the Commission had done its work, and we'd filed our report, and we gave it to Mr. Mandela, we recommended a number of things that ought to be done to restore society. We recommended that certain people ought to be investigated for the possibility of prosecutions. And about 5 years after that was handed in, Mr. Mbeki, who had become president by the time, so it must have been 6 or 7 years later, decided that there would be a pardon for all of those who had not been given amnesty, but who were still alive, perpetrators. He said, we've got to close this thing down. We can't hunt the Nazis for the rest of our lives. We've got to get on with life. The civil society organizations in South Africa, human rights organizations, a lot of individuals, academics, myself included, wrote a letter of protest to the president and said, we've got absolutely no problem with you pardoning people, but they've got to be pardoned on the same basis as those people who came to the Truth Commission looking for amnesty. In other words, we want to know who are they. We want to see them. The victims must have a right to respond to the possible pardon. And it's got to be a public forum. Well, Mr. Mbeki said he will take this into consideration. It still has not happened. And so we have a lot of unfinished business to deal with in South Africa. But the Truth Commission was one initial step to try and initiate this process of healing, this process of recognition, of reconciliation, while ensuring that there was as much justice as possible. 2 more comments. 1, the newspapers like to say that what we were doing through the Truth Commission is substituting truth for justice. We were saying to people, no, you know, there's going to be no justice. You're not going to see your perpetrator spending the rest of his day, rest of his or her life in jail. No justice, but truth. And is truth a form of justice? And that becomes a very tense debate. You know, I would say if your interpretation of justice is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and a pint of blood for a pint of blood, no, there was no justice. But if justice is restorative justice, and if justice is sensitive justice to the needs of victims, then maybe we began a process of broad-based inclusive justice in South Africa. Restoring the human dignity, yes, but we can't unchop the tree. All we can do is to begin to create a different kind of society. And, as I've hinted through this talk, I don't think we did it very well, because somehow those people who were expecting reparations, and not everybody wanted them, but those people who were expecting reparations had to wait for 5 years before they got them. And then they got a considerably reduced fee. I mean, for heaven's sake, Mr. Mbeki, give it to them! It's a tiny, tiny, tiny little piece of the national budget. Give it to them! We didn't do that. So we're not as compassionate as what the Commission recommended. That's my one comment. The other comment is, and it's certainly related, we're not a reconciled society. And if you've been to South Africa, you will see the difference between the squatter camp and the nice white suburbs. Difficult thing to transform. I'm not sure that we've worked hard enough at it. So when I arrived here yesterday. There was just the tail end of a discussion. And somebody, I think, asked, what does justice have to do with equality? And we can get into a long debate there. But when some people have so much that they don't know what to do with their money, and other people don't have enough money to feed their kids, then there's something wrong. There's something fundamentally wrong. And we have not coped with that as well as we should in South Africa, although I want to tell you a lot of improvement has happened. So if you come to South Africa, I can take you to meet with a bunch of young people in the township who will wave their finger in your face and say nothing has changed since apartheid. We know better off now than we were then. And you know what? They're fundamentally wrong. Number one, they've got the vote. And how are they using their vote? But I can understand why they say that. Because they're still living in the townships. They are still unemployed. They still have terrible education for their kids. And yes, the roof still leaks. So rebuilding a society is a very, very difficult process. The Truth Commission was one attempt. And so people have confronted me again and again and said, well, now, come on. You guys have done it all. Did the TRC work? Did the TRC work? I say to them, look, I think three things. Number one, because of the human rights hearings, etc., nobody in South Africa can ever again, if they're at all reasonable, say it didn't happen. They know. They know. Number two, the Commission got people to begin to wrestle with this thing called reconciliation. Some for, some against, but we said, you know, what does it mean to live together? I think it's a question which you in America ask yourselves. If you don't, you should, but I know you do. And the third thing, that commission said to victims, people who had been terribly abused, people who had been abused and would never think of going to the police to report their abuse, because they'd probably get beaten up and thrown out the door at best. We said to them, hey, you have certain rights. And we've recorded your story. We've tried to capture it. We've included your particular story, your transcript, every 22,000 of you. We've recorded that and we have it in the National Archive. And you and your kids and your grandkids and your great-great-grandkids will be able to go and access it and find your story in the total struggle for a new South Africa. So no, the TRC didn't wave a fairy godmother's wand and have everybody living happily ever after. We did make an intervention, and I want to tell you, and this is what politicians do, I don't think the politicians have applied their minds to the extent that they should about healing the country. We have corruption. We have an exorbitant sum of money being paid for so-called security developments in the president's house. We buy arms and weapons, a series of ships to protect our borders. You know, we don't have a, excuse my expression, a hope in hell of protecting our borders if anybody really wanted to attack us. That's all the trimmings. I wish we could put it aside and begin to create a more equitable society. A society where black and white and Jew and Greek and Christian and Muslim and everybody else could begin to engage one another and move forward. We've taken the first step, but we've got a lot of work to do. And for you as Americans, I hope you've got ears to hear. We've got work to do at home. I think you've got work to do here. But the Truth Commission was one attempt to try and do something. But I've spoken longer than I ever intended talking, Stacey. Thank you.